welcome back to Age of the Classics, where today we continue the story of Abby Abigail and her quest to get the right story. We start in on Chapter 2, Read All About It. Abby's real name was Abigail. She was named after her mother and an aunt of her dad's. But when she was very little, her dad used to sing her a song that went like this. Pack up your old troubles in your old Abby bag, and smile, boy, smile. It was a song he learned when he was a soldier fighting in the Great War. Abby loved it. She begged Dad, sing my song, sing the Abby song. Pretty soon, everyone began to call her Abby, which was also short for Abigail, and the name stuck. Abby did not like the name Abigail anyway. It didn't fit her. It was too flouncy. Abby was not a flouncy girl. Right now, she was feeling especially exasperated with flounces because the stool she was sitting on was covered with them. Ruthie and the garden club ladies had left, and Abby was finishing her newspaper for Dad. She had to sit with one leg bent under her to reach the typewriter because the new flouncy stool was as soft as a marshmallow and too low. Abby rolled her newspaper out of the typewriter and read it. She was very pleased with her headline. The Howards are coming, yeah! That ought to get Dad's attention. Under the headline, Abby had written, Mrs. Howard is in the Mother's Garden Club. Yeah, Mrs. Howard and her son, Sterling, are going to be staying with the Abigails for a while. Mr. Howard's in Chicago. Having the Howards here will be fun because Sterling can play catch with Abby Abigail, the best 9-year-old catcher in Cincinnati. Garden Club trouble. Flock Spot puts Mrs. Wilmore beside herself. Abby was struggling with her drawing of two Mrs. Wilmores when she heard the car horn's cheery honkety-honk that signaled her favorite moment of the day. Dad was home from work. Abby snatched up her newspaper and flew downstairs. Extra, extra, read all about it! She shouted, waving her newspaper as Dad climbed out of his car. Dad caught Abby up in his arms. How's my girl? He asked. Great, said Kit when her feet were back on the ground. Look, I got a newspaper for you today. Dad's blue eyes were twinkling. He smiled a broad smile as he took Kit's newspaper, Abby's newspaper, and handed her the real one. He read Abby's headline in a booming voice. The Howards are coming! Then he glanced at Kit and spoke in his normal voice. Are they coming for dinner? Abby said, It's better than that. Read the whole story. Abby watched as Dad's eyes scanned the story. She noticed, much to her surprise, that his smile faded as he read. When Dad spoke, his voice sounded funny, as if he was trying too hard to be hearty. Well, that's big news. I'm a lucky guy to have my own personal reporter to keep me on top of all the late-breaking stories, he said. Grown-ups are funny, Abby thought as she walked along next to Dad. They don't react the way you expect them to. Anyway, anyone would think that Dad was not pleased to have the Howards come to stay. But why on earth wouldn't he be? 2 days later, Abby and Ruthie were sitting on the front steps waiting for Sterling and Mrs. Howard to arrive. The girls were reading while they waited. At least Ruthie was reading. Abby was too distracted. She was just looking at the pictures in her book. Abby's copy of Robin Hood and His Adventures had belonged to Charlie when he was her age. It had wonderful illustrations, which Abby loved to study. She especially loved reading about the tree houses that Robin and his men lived in. The houses were connected by swinging bridges and catwalks made out of vines. Abby longed to sleep in a treehouse high up near the sky, surrounded by leaves. She imagined that at night stars peeked through the leaves and the wind made the branches sway. Abby had spent many hours drawing plans for a treehouse that she and Ruthie could build. Abby was not very good at sketching. Her drawings always looked like doghouses stuck up in trees. They didn't look anything like the tree houses in Sherwood Forest. It was hot, and the girls were licking chunks of ice that had been chipped off the big block of ice in the icebox. Abby had her catcher's mitt next to her, too. She wanted Sterling to see right away that she was interested in books and baseball, and was not the type of girl who only cared about things like dusting and baking and dresses. Abby's ice junk had melted to a sliver when, at last, a cab pulled up to the end of the driveway. Abby and Ruthie stood up and waited politely on the front steps. The cab door opened and Mrs. Howard and the boy got out. When Abby saw Sterling, Abby felt as if someone had dropped her ice chip down her back. She was so surprised. Ruthie whistled softly. "I thought your mother said that Sterling was about your age. He looks like he's in kindergarten." Sterling stood next to the cab on two of the skinniest legs Abby had ever seen. He was short and pale and skinny all over. His head looked too big for his scrawny neck. The screen door opened and Mother came out of the house. She stood between Abby and Ruthie and put her hands on their shoulders. Mother said, "Sterling's small for his age, because his health is delicate." Yeah, but I'm sure he's a very pleasant fellow, you know. Come on, ladies, let's go greet our guests and make them feel welcome." Abby and Ruthie and Mother walked down the steps toward the driveway. Mrs. Howard and the cab driver were unloading boxes and suitcases from the cab. Sterling just stood there. "Oh, Margaret, you're such a dear to have us. Shake hands with Mrs. Abigail, Lemmy, and say hello to Abby and Ruthie," Mrs. Howard said to Sterling. Sterling shook Mother's hand and nodded at the girls. He looked even worse close up. He had colorless hair, colorless eyes, and a red, runny nose. Abby towered over him, and Ruthie could have made two of them. He was so puny. "Oh dear," fussed Mrs. Howard. "All this excitement's not good for my little Sterling, the poor lamb. He'll have to lie down and rest right away. Yeah, you see?" Mother said, "Yeah, of course. Come with me and we'll get him all settled." Abby and Ruthie stood on the driveway and watched as Mrs. Howard and Mother propelled Sterling into the house. The cab driver followed them carrying an armload of suitcases and boxes. As soon as they were gone, Abby turned to Ruthie and imitated Sterling. She snuffled her nose and made her eyes wide and unblinking. Ruthie giggled, then said, "Of course, in the fairy tales, you always learn not to judge by appearances, Abby. Lots of times, perfectly nice people are under a spell. Think of Beauty and the Beast. Maybe that's what's wrong with Sterling." But over the next few days, it was clear to Kit that Ruthie's Beauty and the Beast theory didn't work in real life. At least not in Sterling's case, Abby thought. He never said a word, but he didn't have to. His mother did all the talking, and most of her sentences began with the words, "Sterling can't." When Abby and Ruthie invited Sterling to run through the sprinkler with them, Mrs. Howard said, "Sterling can't be in the sun because his hair's so fair, and Sterling can't run because he's got weak lungs, and Sterling can't get wet because he might catch a chill, yeah, and Sterling can't play in the yard because he's allergic to bee stings. You see?" Abby abandoned any idea of Sterling helping with a treehouse or playing catch. Pretty soon, Abby and Ruthie gave up on inviting Sterling to do anything, because the answer was always he can't. At first, Abby thought Mrs. Howard was making the whole thing up about how fragile Sterling was. It wasn't as if he had a sickness like rickets or scurvy, or any of the really interesting diseases Abby knew about from reading pirate stories. Sterling didn't even have any spots or rashes. However, after he'd been there about a week, Sterling got sick. Truly sick. It was only a cold, but he had a fever and a terrible cough. Mrs. Howard said that he had to stay in bed and have all his meals brought to him on a tray. Abby could hear Sterling coughing and sniffling and blowing his nose all day long. Everyone had to tiptoe past the door to his room so they wouldn't disturb Sterling in case he was napping. Abby held her nose when she passed by because the hall smelled strongly of Vicks Vapor Rub, even with the door shut. But one afternoon, Abby noticed that the door to the guest room was open. She sneaked a peek and saw that Sterling was propped up on the pillows, and Mrs. Howard was nowhere to be seen. Of course, it was hard to see anything in the room. It was dark because the shades were pulled down. Abby stood in the doorway and looked at Sterling's moon-white face on the pillow. "Gosh, it's sure stuffy in here. Want me to open the window or something, Sterling?" Sterling nodded, and Abby opened the window a crack so that a breath of air and sunlight came filtering through. "That's better. Hey!" Abby said, looking at a photograph next to Sterling's bed. "Is that Ernie Lombardi, the catcher for the Reds?" Sterling's eyes were as unblinking as an owl's as he looked at Abby. His nose was stuffed up, so his voice sounded weirdly low and husky. For a second, Abby didn't understand. Then she laughed. "Snaz, yeah, that's Ernie Lombardi's nickname, because he has such a big old nose." Sterling blew his nose in answer, which made a honking sound. Abby laughed again. "Ernie Lombardi's my favorite player on the Reds. He's the reason I'm a catcher. Well, that's because my dad was a star catcher on his college team, You know that Ernie's the biggest guy on the Reds? Are you 6'3", whispered Sterling hoarsely. 230 pounds. Abby was delighted. She rattled on. It's funny that you like him. Yeah, 'cause he's so big and you're just so little. Sterling didn't sound a bit offended, even though right after Abby spoke, she realized that she'd said something she shouldn't have. Abby was suddenly inspired. Hey, you know what? I have a newspaper article about Ernie Lombardi. It's got a photograph of him holding up 7 baseballs in one hand at the same time. It used to be tacked up on the wall, but my mother wouldn't let me put it back up in my room after it was painted pink. I bet I can find it. You want to see it? Sterling nodded vigorously, and Abby noticed that his eyes weren't colorless at all. They were gray. Abby said, yeah, I'll go get the article and you can read all about it. She ran back to her room and rummaged through the drawers of her desk. She hoped Mother hadn't thrown it away. Scrambling wildly through the bottom drawer, Abby found the newspaper at last. She raced back to Sterling's room, shouting, I found it! As Abby flung the door open, she hit Mrs. Howard, who was standing right inside with a silver tray in her hands. Wah! Shrieked Mrs. Howard. She lurched forward and the tray, which had one of Mother's best china teacups and saucers on it, went flying. The hot tea sloshed out all over the rug. The cup hit the floor and shattered, and the tray clanged to the ground with a noise like cymbals. Mrs. Howard fussed. Oh dear, what's happened? What's all this noise? Abby tried to apologize in a voice louder than Sterling's coughs. Mother came in and exclaimed, Goodness gracious, now what? Will someone please tell me what's going on? Asked Mother, not sounding at all like her usual serene self. Everyone looked at Abby. Abby knew that Mother disliked messes, so she tried to explain how this one was an accident. Well, I was coming in here to show Sterling a picture of Ernie Lombardi. Yeah, you see? I didn't know that Mrs. Howard was right behind the door. I was in a hurry, and Mother held up her hand to stop Abby. Don't tell me. I can imagine the rest. How many times have I told you? Slow down and watch where you're going, Abby. Abby apologized while Mother stooped down to pick up the broken cup. Just look what you done. Abby was shocked. It wasn't like Mother to scold her like this. But it wasn't my fault. It's an accident. It's nobody's fault. Yeah, you see? Mother repeated. Nobody's fault. And yet, look at the mess we're in. Please, go now. I'll help Mrs. Howard clean up. And Abby, don't barge in here bothering Sterling and making messes anymore, you see? But I didn't. Abby began. That's enough, Abby, said Mother, and shooed her out. Abby gave up. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her room. Mother seemed to think that the mess was all her fault, but it wasn't. She didn't mean to knock Mrs. Howard over, and stupid old Sterling was more to blame for the mess than Abby was. If he weren't sick, his mother wouldn't have been bringing him hot tea in the middle of the afternoon in the first place. Abby flung herself down at the desk and looked at the wrinkled newspaper article in her hand. What did it matter that her photo of Ernie Lombardi holding 7 baseballs was crumpled up? She couldn't put it up on her new pink walls anyway, and she sure wasn't going to show it to Sterling. She wasn't going to be nice to that old sniffle-nosed Sterling ever again. Look at the trouble it caused her. Nothing made Abby more angry than being unjustly accused. She didn't mind a good, fair fight, but to be blamed for something that's not her fault, she couldn't stand. In books, when people were accused of crimes they didn't commit, like Nancy Drew or Dick Tracy, they always came around and proved they were innocent. Abby could see that in her case, she was going to have to speak for herself, and she knew just how to do it. She'd write a special newspaper for Dad. Then, at least one person would know her side of the story. Abby rolled a piece of paper into the typewriter, and in capital letters, she typed her headline, "It's not fair!" This concludes Chapter 2 of Meet Abby. Next week, join us for Chapter 3, entitled, "It's Not Fair." Thank you for joining us.